Welcome to Dead Scary Stories. If you enjoy these stories, please like, share, and subscribe. Also, comment which story you thought was the scariest. Now lie back, relax, and let sleep consume you. The baby monitor was one of those gadgets my wife insisted we get, though I wasn't keen on it. She liked the idea of being able to see Ellie while she slept, and I figured it couldn't hurt. It sat on the coffee table every night, the dim screen showing our little girl in her crib, the camera's night vision casting the room in a grainy grey. Most nights I barely noticed it. I'd glance at the screen occasionally, see her tiny body tucked under her blanket, and get back to whatever I was doing. It became background noise in my life, another flickering light among many. That Thursday night, the house felt especially still. My wife had gone to bed early, but I was wide awake. The only sounds were the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional creak of the house settling. I was slumped on the couch, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, when something on the monitor caught my eye. The image flickered, the kind of glitch you might expect with gadgets like that. I barely registered it at first, but then the flicker turned into static for a brief moment before the picture returned. The room looked different somehow. I leaned forward, narrowing my eyes at the screen. The crib was there, the shape of Ellie still curled up in her usual corner, but the light seemed dimmer. The room on the screen felt darker, and I couldn't place why. I stared at the monitor, trying to figure it out when I noticed it. There was something standing over the crib. It was tall and thin, its limbs looked stretched, almost spindly, and its skin or whatever covered it was grey and smooth like a drowned body. Its head was angled downward, bent slightly at the neck, leaning toward Ellie. There weren't eyes, not really, but the faint depressions where they should have been seemed to focus on her, on my baby. Its arms hung low, almost brushing the bars of the crib. I froze, gripping the edge of the couch, my breath caught somewhere in my chest. The thing didn't move, it didn't sway or shift, it just stood there. I bolted to my feet, the monitor clattering to the floor as I ran for the stairs. My legs felt sluggish, like I was moving through water, but my mind raced with panic. I could feel the blood pounding in my ears as I reached Ellie's door and shoved it open. The room was quiet. Nothing was out of place. The crib was just as we'd left it, and Ellie was there, bundled under her blanket. She was breathing softly, her chest rising and falling in that tiny, fragile way babies breathe. I leaned over the crib, my hands trembling, and touched her cheek. Her skin was cold, not just cool, but cold enough that it sent a jolt through me. I pulled the blanket tighter around her, glancing at the window. It was open. The latch dangled, swaying gently, though we never left it unlocked. We never left it open. I stepped closer, feeling the cool night air streaming in. Outside, the yard was pitch black, the faint outlines of trees barely visible in the distance. The glass was clear, no smudges or scratches, and the frame showed no signs of damage, but it was open. I slammed it shut, twisting the latch until I was sure it wouldn't budge, and turned back to Ellie. Her breathing was soft and steady now, the color returning to her skin. I stood there for a long time, gripping the edge of the crib, scanning every corner of the room. The light of the baby monitor camera blinked faintly, and I realized I'd left the screen downstairs. The silence was pressing, like the room itself was holding its breath, but Ellie stayed asleep, undisturbed by my frantic checking. Back downstairs, I grabbed the monitor from the floor and stared at the screen. It was blank now, not static, just black, as if the camera had turned off completely. I flipped it over, fiddling with the buttons, but nothing happened. It was dead. My hands shook as I pulled out the memory card and plugged it into my laptop, desperate for something to make sense. I scrubbed through the recording, watching the footage of Ellie's room leading up to that moment. There was nothing. The recording jumped, skipping the moment when I'd seen it on the screen. It went straight from Ellie sleeping peacefully to the blank room I'd walked into moments later. No static, no glitches, just a clean cut, as if the camera had simply stopped working. I replayed it 3 times, searching for anything I might have missed. There wasn't a single frame of the thing standing over her crib. The rest of the night, I couldn't sit still. I checked the window in Ellie's room 3 more times. I paced the hallway outside her door, straining my ears for any sound, any creak of the floorboards or rustle of fabric. There was nothing. Just the cold stillness of the house. My wife stirred once but didn't wake, and I didn't dare tell her. What could I say? That I'd seen something on the monitor, that wasn't there when I got to the room, that the window had been wide open when we'd locked it tight. By morning, the house felt normal again, but the image of that thing hadn't left me. The stretch of its arms, the grey, lifeless skin, the way it leaned over the crib like it was studying her. When I checked the window again, it was still locked. The latch held firm, the glass cold to the touch. Ellie giggled when I picked her up, her warmth returning like nothing had ever happened. But when I look at her crib, I can't stop picturing it. Something had been there. Something had leaned over her while she slept. And I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't finished. I came home late that night, later than usual. Work had been dragging lately, long hours, endless meetings, and a boss who didn't seem to know the meaning of the word clock out. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the streetlights were out, and the entire neighborhood looked like a stretch of some forgotten ghost town. No porch lights, no faint glows from windows, just darkness and silence. It wasn't unusual for the power to go out in our area during storms, and we'd had a bad one earlier that day. I didn't think much of it. My house was set back a little further than the others, the driveway cutting through a line of skinny trees that separated my lot from the rest of the street. The windows were black as I parked, the air still except for the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat, locked the car, and walked up the path to my door. My boots scuffed the concrete, the sound oddly loud in the silence. As I reached for the doorknob, I noticed it felt colder than usual. Inside, the house was exactly as I'd left it, dark, quiet, with that faint smell of stale air that builds up when you've been out all day. I flicked the light switch out of habit, but of course nothing happened. The power was still out. My phone torch lit up the entryway as I moved through the house, heading for the kitchen to drop my things. I was halfway there when I noticed it. The television was on. It was an old flat screen I'd been meaning to replace for months, something I bought second-hand years ago. I don't even remember the last time I turned it on, to be honest. It sat on its stand in the corner of the living room, unused and gathering dust. And yet, there it was, glowing faintly in the darkness, the screen flickering with static. White noise spilled into the silence, soft and distorted, like the whisper of a radio trying to tune itself. I stopped in my tracks, staring at it. The power was out. The house was dark. Nothing else was on. The TV shouldn't have been working. I walked closer, my phone torch bouncing across the walls, illuminating the edges of the screen and the little dust particles floating in the air. The static buzzed louder as I stepped closer, a strange, irregular pattern of white and black swirls moving across the glass. The moment I was close enough to reach out, the static stopped. The screen went black, so black that it seemed to absorb the light from my phone. For a moment, I thought it had turned off completely, but as I stared, I realized the screen wasn't empty. There was something on it, a reflection. It was me, standing there, frozen, with my torch in one hand, and behind me, just over my shoulder, was something else. I couldn't move, my eyes locked on the shape in the reflection. Its outline faint but unmistakable. It was tall, taller than the frame of the TV, with a narrow body that seemed to stretch unnaturally upwards. The head was long, tapering to a rounded point, and its limbs hung at strange angles. Its surface gleamed faintly in the light of my torch, a texture that reminded me of wet stone. But the worst part was its face, if you could call it that. There were no eyes, no mouth, just two small indentations where the eyes should have been, and they glowed faintly like dim embers. My breath caught as the figure began to move, not in the room behind me, but in the screen itself. It tilted its head slightly, those dim embers focusing on me. I whipped around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, exactly as it should have been. When I turned back to the TV, the reflection was gone, just a black screen, blank and silent. I stepped back, nearly stumbling over the coffee table, my mind racing. I wanted to convince myself it was a trick of the glass, maybe a distorted reflection of something else in the room. But the static had been real. The sound of it still echoed faintly in my ears. I reached out, tentatively, and touched the power button on the TV. The screen blinked off, the room plunging back into total darkness. I stood there, gripping the edge of the coffee table, unsure of what to do. My phone torch trembled in my hand as I scanned the room, my ears straining for any sound. The faint rustling of leaves outside had stopped. The house was utterly still, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned towards the hallway, heading for the stairs. My bedroom was upstairs, and right then, all I wanted was to lock myself inside and wait for the power to come back. But as I stepped into the hall, I froze. The air felt colder, and there was something faint, just barely audible. A soft, irregular clicking sound coming from somewhere above me. I shone my torch up the staircase. The beam cutting through the darkness. The stairs looked normal, the walls bare, the door at the top slightly ajar, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder as I stood there, staring up into the dark. My legs felt rooted to the spot, my mind screaming at me to leave, to run, to do anything but go up those stairs. And yet I found myself stepping forward, one trembling foot at a time, the torchlight shaking as it swept across the walls. The clicking stopped the moment I reached the top step. The door to my bedroom was open wider now, and beyond it the room was pitch black. My heart hammered as I pushed the door open and shone the torch inside. The bed was empty. The room was empty, but the window was open, the curtains fluttering faintly in the cold night air. I stepped closer, peering out into the darkness beyond. The yard was still, the trees swaying slightly in the breeze. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. And then I noticed the television screen downstairs, glowing faintly in the reflection of the window. It was on again. Static filled the screen, the black and white swirls moving in that strange, irregular pattern. And there, in the reflection of the window, I could see it. The figure standing in front of the TV, its head tilted upwards, those dim, glowing indentations fixed on the ceiling. It was looking for me. I woke up to the stars. They were sharp and endless, pinpricks of cold light cutting through the black sky. It took a moment for me to realize that I wasn't in bed. The softness of the mattress, the warmth of the blankets, the hum of the ceiling fan, all of it was gone. Instead, I felt damp grass under my hands, cool earth pressing against my palms, and the sharp chill of night air clinging to my skin. My body was stiff, and my nightgown clung to me like a second skin, damp with dew. My feet were bare. I blinked, my eyes adjusting to the darkness, and tried to make sense of it. The yard was quiet, the kind of deep silence that feels unnatural in a suburban neighborhood. No rustle of leaves, no distant bark of a dog, not even the faint hum of cars from the nearby highway, just the silence and the stars, and me, lying there in the middle of the grass. When my husband found me, I couldn't move. My legs refused to respond, and my arms felt limp at my sides. I was staring straight ahead, unblinking, my mouth dry and slightly open like I was caught mid-breath. I could see the panic on his face as he shook me, his hands gripping my shoulders, his voice distant and muffled as though it was coming from underwater. I wasn't asleep. I wasn't awake. I was caught somewhere in between, trapped in my own body, the stars above me growing sharper and brighter until they felt like they were going to pierce straight through my skull. Then everything went dark. I woke up properly in bed, as though nothing had happened. The sheets were tangled around my legs, and my pillow was damp with sweat. My husband was sitting in the chair by the window, watching me, his face pale and drawn. He didn't say a word, but the way he looked at me sent a chill down my spine. I reached out for him, but he flinched slightly, like he wasn't sure if I was real. That's when I noticed the ache behind my ear. It wasn't sharp, not at first, more of a dull throbbing, like a bruise that had been pressed too hard. I touched it absent-mindedly, and the pain shot through me, hot and searing, making me wince. My fingers came away clean. No blood, no mark, nothing to suggest there was anything wrong, but I could feel it. A small, neat incision, barely the width of a fingernail, hidden just behind my earlobe. The skin around it was raised and tender, as though it had been stitched together recently. I spent the morning trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd scratched myself in my sleep, or maybe it was an old injury I hadn't noticed before. But as the day went on, the ache grew worse. Every time I touched it, the burning sensation flared up again, making my head pound and my vision blur. I thought about calling the doctor, but what would I even say? That I'd woken up in the yard with no memory of how I'd gotten there, and now I had a mysterious cut behind my ear? It sounded ridiculous, even in my own head. By lunchtime, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized myself. My skin was pale and clammy, my hair hanging limp around my face, and my eyes were bloodshot, with dark circles etched underneath them. I leaned closer to the mirror, pulling my hair back to examine the incision. It looked deliberate. The edges were too clean, too precise, like it had been made with surgical tools. I ran my finger over it again, and the burning flared up so intensely that I had to grip the sink to steady myself. The rest of the day passed in a haze. My husband hovered around me, silent and watchful, like he was afraid to leave me alone. I barely ate, barely spoke, my mind racing in circles. By nightfall, I felt like I was running on autopilot, my body moving without my brain fully registering it. I climbed into bed, the ache behind my ear pulsing in time with my heartbeat, and closed my eyes. I dreamed of the stars. They were brighter this time, so bright they seemed to drown out everything else. I was floating, weightless and cold, the light pressing against my eyes until they watered. The silence was deafening, a pressure building in my ears that felt like it was going to split my skull. I wanted to scream, but my mouth wouldn't open. I wanted to move, but my body wouldn't respond. The stars grew closer, sharper, until I could feel their edges slicing into me, and then I woke up in the yard again. The grass was damp and cold against my skin, and the stars were just as bright as they had been in my dream. My arms were stretched out at my sides, my fingers digging into the earth, and my nightgown clung to me like it was part of my skin. My husband wasn't there this time. I was alone. I sat up slowly, my head pounding, and touched the back of my ear. The incision was still there, but it felt different, bigger. The skin around it was raw and swollen, and when I pressed it lightly, a thin, clear liquid seeped out, running down my neck in cold rivulets. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, coming out as a dry, gasping noise. The stars above me seemed to pulse faintly, their light flickering in a way that didn't seem natural. For a moment, I thought I could see shapes moving between them, long, spindly shapes that didn't make sense, their edges blurring and shifting like smoke. I blinked and the shapes were gone. But the stars were still there, burning into my eyes, sharper and brighter than I'd ever seen them. I don't remember how I got back inside. The next thing I knew, I was sitting on the edge of the bed, my hands trembling and my vision swimming. The incision behind my ear burned so fiercely that it felt like my entire head was on fire. My husband was still asleep, his breathing deep and even, completely unaware. I reached for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone, but the screen was dead. The house was silent, the kind of silence that felt alive, pressing in on me from all sides. I could still feel the stars, even though I was inside now. Their light was burned into my eyes, their sharp edges cutting into my mind, and the shapes that had moved between them were still there, just out of sight, just beyond the edge of my vision. And the incision behind my ear, it wasn't just a cut anymore. I could feel something moving under my skin. The summer of 1989 was when they lost her. I was 12 then, and I remember the news stories well enough. A group of teenagers had gone camping in the woods just outside of town, a patch of state forest with a river running through it. The kind of place kids in small towns gravitate to, far enough from home to feel like freedom, but close enough for parents not to panic. It was a local girl who vanished that night, a junior at the high school. Her name was Laura Myers, though most people around town called her Laurie. She had been with her friends camping near the river, and they woke up to find her sleeping bag empty. No sign of a struggle, no screams during the night. She was just gone. I remember the search parties combing through the woods, dozens of them marching in lines, their voices echoing as they called her name. They brought dogs, helicopters, everything they could, but there wasn't a single trace of her. No footprints, no dropped belongings, just the campsite, exactly as it had been when everyone fell asleep. It didn't make sense then. And it still doesn't now. People talked about it for years. Small towns never forget things like that. What I didn't expect, what no one expected, was for her to come back. It was late August when they found her. I'd been hiking out by the river, a place I hadn't visited in years, but something about the day made me restless. The air was hot and dry, the kind that presses down on you and makes the world feel too quiet. I'd been walking for maybe an hour, the river a faint shimmer through the trees, when I saw her. She was standing in the middle of a clearing, her back to me. I froze, confused for a moment. It was her hair that I noticed first, long, dark, and slightly wavy. Exactly like the old photos of her on the posters they'd hung up 30 years ago. She was wearing a denim jacket over a white tank top, her shorts and sneakers looking as clean as if they'd just come off a store shelf. I thought she might have been lost, or maybe someone playing a cruel joke, but when she turned to face me, my breath caught. Her face hadn't changed, not in the way it should have. She looked like she was still 17, just as she had when she disappeared. Her skin was smooth, her eyes bright. Her clothes weren't just clean, they were spotless. No dirt on her shoes, no sweat on her face. I called for help. People came, people who remembered, who couldn't believe what they were seeing. The authorities took her in, asked her all the questions you'd expect, but she didn't have any answers. She didn't remember where she'd been. She didn't remember anything after falling asleep in that tent in 1989. 34 years of nothing. But there was one thing, one detail they didn't put in the papers. She kept whispering the same phrase over and over again. They didn't want me. I didn't sleep well after that. None of us did. Seeing her like that, untouched by time, looking like a ghost of the past, wasn't something you could forget. People whispered about it in the grocery store, in the bars, everywhere. Some said it was a hoax. Others said it was something worse, something that shouldn't have happened. I couldn't get her out of my head. About a week after she came back, I went out to the woods again. I told myself it was to clear my head, to shake off the tension that had settled over the town. The sky was overcast, the light dim and grey. The woods felt different, like they were holding their breath. I walked the same path by the river, past the clearing where I'd found her. The trees loomed closer together here, their branches almost blotting out the sky. The ground was soft beneath my boots, damp and spongy, though there hadn't been rain in days. I don't know how far I went before I saw it. A tree taller than the others, its bark grey and smooth. There was something wrong about it, something I couldn't put into words. It wasn't dead, exactly, but there were no leaves on its branches. They twisted out at odd angles like something frozen mid-reach, and at the base of the tree there was something carved into the bark. Letters, faint but precise. I stepped closer, my breath catching as I read the words. She wasn't the one. I didn't understand what it meant, I still don't, but as I stood there staring at the letters, I felt it. Something behind me, a presence like being in a crowded room, but knowing someone's standing just a little too close. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there, just the woods, stretching endlessly in every direction. But the silence, it wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that swallows everything, that makes the world feel smaller. I could feel it pressing in on me, like the woods themselves were alive, watching, judging. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the trees, my lungs burning and my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't tell anyone about the tree or the carving or the silence. What could I say? No one would believe me, but I can't stop thinking about her, about the words she whispered, about the way she looked when they found her, untouched by time, but not untouched. They didn't want her. I keep thinking about what that means, about what they're still out there, waiting for. I've been fishing out on Clearwater Lake since I was big enough to hold a rod, and in all those years, nothing much had ever happened out there. You'd get the odd moment of excitement when something big was biting, or when a storm rolled in faster than expected, but that was it. The lake was just the lake, calm, quiet, dependable. It was August, the air muggy and still when I decided to head out for a late-night trip. The kind of night where the water stretches out like black glass and the world feels smaller, wrapped in darkness. I'd loaded up the boat and pushed off from the dock just before sundown, planning to spend a few hours catching catfish before heading back home. The fishing was steady but not remarkable. The odd tug here and there kept me occupied, but mostly I just sat in the quiet. The stars were out in force, scattered across the sky like someone had spilled a box of pins. The only sounds were the faint ripple of the water against the hull and the distant cry of some bird I couldn't see. It was somewhere past midnight when the lights appeared. They weren't far, maybe a few hundred yards from where I was anchored. 3 of them, hovering just above the surface of the water. They were bright enough to catch my eye, but soft, almost like lanterns swaying in the dark. I didn't hear a boat engine or the splash of oars, nothing to suggest someone was out there. I stood, squinting at them, trying to figure out what they were. The lights didn't flicker or shift like a fire might, but they weren't like any electric light I'd seen either. They moved, no, floated, in a way that didn't make sense. Perfectly still one moment, gliding across the water the next, but without disturbing it. I watched them for a long time, long enough that my legs started to ache from standing. Then they began to move closer, and that's when I felt it. Not fear, exactly, but something else. A sense that I shouldn't be there, that I was somewhere I didn't belong. I turned to sit down to grab the oars and head back to shore, but my body wouldn't move. It wasn't like I was paralyzed. I could still breathe, still feel my heartbeat pounding in my chest. But it was as if I was stuck in place. My hands stayed frozen on the edge of the boat, my legs locked where they were. The lights grew brighter, closer, until they filled my vision completely. I couldn't look away. They weren't just lights anymore, they were something else, something alive. They pulsed, each one in perfect time with the others, a rhythm I could feel in my chest like a second heartbeat. And then everything went black. I woke up on the shore just after sunrise, the sky streaked with orange and pink. My clothes were soaked through, my arms and legs caked with mud. I sat up slowly, every muscle in my body aching. The boat was gone. It wasn't just that it had drifted off, it was gone. No sign of it on the water, no scrape marks where it might have hit the shore. It was as if it had never been there at all. My hands were trembling as I pushed myself to my feet, and that's when I noticed the marks on my arms. Dozens of tiny punctures, like pinpricks running up and down from my wrist to my elbows. The skin around them was red and swollen, but they didn't hurt. Not at first. I stumbled back to the truck, leaving a trail of wet footprints in the dirt. I didn't go to the hospital or call anyone. I couldn't explain why, but I didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to even think about it. That night, the marks on my arms began to itch. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying not to scratch. The sensation was unbearable, a crawling heat that seemed to spread the more I tried to ignore it. When I got up to look in the mirror, I saw that the punctures had scabbed over, tiny black dots like burned-out matches. The itching didn't stop, not until I coughed. It came out of nowhere, sudden and sharp, like something was stuck in my throat. I bent over the sink, hacking and gasping, until something small and hard hit the porcelain with a metallic ping. It was a sphere, no bigger than a marble. It shone under the bathroom light, perfectly smooth and silver, cold to the touch. I picked it up with shaking fingers, the chill of it biting into my skin. It felt wrong in a way I can't explain, as if it didn't belong in this world. I put it in a jar, screwed the lid on tight, and shoved it to the back of the cupboard. I haven't opened it since. The punctures healed, but the scars remain, tiny dots that run up and down my arms like tracks, a reminder of that night on the lake. I haven't been back out there since. I tell people I've given up fishing, that the boat must have sunk or drifted off, but the truth is, I don't think it's out there anymore. Some nights, when the house is quiet and the world feels too still, I hear something faint, like the hum of electricity in an empty room. And in those moments, I can feel the cold pressing in on me again, the lights burning behind my eyes. I don't know what they were, or why they let me go, but I can't shake the feeling that they're not done with me. The overnight hauls were never my favorite, but they paid the bills. There was a strange calmness to the long stretches of empty highway, broken only by the hum of the tires on the asphalt. Most nights, the only thing to keep me company was the soft crackle of the CB radio and the occasional pair of headlights that passed like ghosts in the opposite lane. That night felt no different. The road ahead was endless, and the glow of my dashboard illuminated the cab in a dim, greenish hue. Somewhere between Kansas City and Denver, I settled into that familiar rhythm, keeping my eyes forward and my hands steady on the wheel. It must have been just after midnight when I noticed the light. It started as a faint glow in the rearview mirror, so dim I almost dismissed it as a reflection from my own brake lights. But as the miles ticked by, the glow didn't fade or shift the way reflections usually do. It stayed there, steady and unwavering, like it was pinned to the center of the mirror. My first thought was that it might be another vehicle, a motorcycle maybe, but there was no sign of headlights, no shape behind the light, just the glow pulsing faintly against the dark. I glanced at the speedometer and eased up on the gas. If it was another vehicle, they'd eventually pass me. The light didn't change. It stayed in the same spot, no closer, no farther. I adjusted the mirror, craning my neck to get a better look, but the rear view gave me nothing. There was just the black ribbon of road stretching behind me and that glow hanging in the distance. I flicked the CB radio on to distract myself, scanning through static and fragments of chatter. The familiar voices of other drivers usually helped keep my mind occupied, but that night it was different. The static got louder. I adjusted the knobs, trying to tune into one of the channels I used regularly, but all I got was garbled noise. Every now and then a word or two would break through, crackling voices like they were coming from underwater. It didn't make sense. The radio had been fine earlier. I fiddled with the settings, half listening as I kept one eye on the road and another on the mirror. The light behind me had grown brighter. It wasn't sudden. It was more like the brightness had crept up on me bit by bit until it was impossible to ignore. My cab was filled with a pale glow now, bright enough to cast soft outlines against the dashboard. I turned my head to look out the window, trying to spot whatever was behind me. But there was nothing. The road was empty. No headlights, no vehicles, just that light hanging there, cutting through the darkness. The radio hissed louder, and I instinctively reached for the dial again. As I did, the light flared. It wasn't subtle this time. It burst like a flashbulb, flooding the cab with white so bright it seared my vision. I slammed on the brakes, gripping the wheel hard enough to hurt. The truck groaned and lurched, tires skidding slightly on the pavement, and for a split second, everything was gone. The light, the road, the cab, everything. When my vision cleared, I was sitting in the same position, hands on the wheel, the hum of the engine steady beneath me. The road stretched ahead, empty and quiet. I blinked, my heart pounding. The radio was off. My headlights were the only source of light now, cutting a narrow beam into the night. I glanced at the dashboard clock and felt my stomach drop. An hour had passed. I pulled over to the shoulder, my hands trembling as I shifted into neutral. The truck hissed as it settled, and I sat there for a long moment trying to catch my breath. The last thing I remembered was hitting the brakes, but now I was an hour away from where I should have been. The map on my GPS confirmed it. I had traveled nearly 60 miles, but I didn't remember driving any of them. I reached for the dash cam, my fingers fumbling as I pulled the memory card free. I always kept it running during my hauls, partly for insurance purposes, and partly because it made me feel safer. If anything weird happened on the road, I'd have proof. I slid the card into my laptop and opened the video file. Static, that's all there was. The recording cut off the moment the light flared and didn't resume until I was already parked on the shoulder. No footage of the road, no sounds from the cab, just a wall of static that hissed in my ears as I stared at the screen. The timestamp jumped, skipping over the missing hour without explanation. I climbed out of the cab, needing to feel the solid ground under my boots. The night air was cold and still, the kind of quiet that presses in from all sides. The highway stretched out in either direction, empty and endless, with no sign of the glow that had followed me. I walked to the back of the truck, my footsteps crunching on the gravel shoulder. Everything seemed normal. The trailer was intact, the tires were fine, and there was no sign of damage or anything out of place. I stood there for a moment staring up at the sky. The stars were brighter out there in the middle of nowhere, but even they felt distant and indifferent, like they had nothing to do with what had just happened. I got back in the cab and drove the rest of the way to Denver without stopping. The radio stayed silent, the rearview mirror empty. But every time I glanced up at the night sky, I felt that faint sense of pressure, like something just beyond my understanding was still out there, just out of reach. I moved into the farmhouse in early spring. It was one of those places that felt like it had been there forever, tucked away on the edge of a thick stretch of woods, miles from the nearest neighbor. The house itself was plain. 2 stories, white paint peeling off the siding with a wraparound porch that sagged just enough to creak when you stepped on it. The seller had called it rustic charm. I thought of it as cheap, which was exactly what I needed. The first week was uneventful. I spent my days unpacking, scrubbing years of grime off the floors and patching up the odd crack here and there. Nights were different. There was something about how dark it got out there, miles away from streetlights and traffic. The only glow came from the moon when it wasn't hidden by the trees. And the silence seemed almost too quiet, if that makes sense. It made every little noise stand out. The house groaned like it was settling into itself, and the woods came alive with the chirps and rustles of creatures I couldn't see. At first, I chalked it up to the novelty of being alone in such a remote spot, but then the clicking started. It was faint. So faint that I almost didn't notice it at first. I was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, and it cut through the usual sounds outside. It wasn't like the wind rattling the trees or the crickets chirping. This was sharper, more precise. It reminded me of the sound you'd get if you tapped 2 stones together, but softer, like it wasn't meant to be heard. I thought maybe it was an animal, a raccoon maybe, or something brushing against the porch. I stayed in bed, convincing myself there was nothing to worry about. The noise came back the next night, and the night after that, always the same, faint and sporadic, like it was just on the edge of my hearing. I never saw anything when I went to check, but it was enough to keep me tossing and turning. By the end of the week, I was sleeping with the lights on. Then came the storm. It rolled in fast, bringing pounding rain and howling wind that whipped through the trees and battered the side of the house. I spent the evening by the fireplace trying to drown out the sound of the wind rattling the windows. When the power went out, I lit a few candles and sat in the dim light, listening to the rain hammering against the roof. The clicking was the last thing on my mind, until the storm ended. I stepped outside the next morning, feeling that strange quiet after a storm when everything feels washed clean. The yard was soaked, the earth soft and churned up from the rain. That's when I noticed the tracks. They started at the edge of the woods where the trees crowded together in a dark tangle of branches. They were long with deep claw marks at the tips, and they pressed deep into the mud as if whatever had made them was heavy. They led straight across the yard, stopping just below my bedroom window. That was the part that got to me. There were no tracks leading away, just those long clawed footprints cutting a path from the woods to the house and ending abruptly beneath my window. I stood there for a long time, staring at the prints and trying to make sense of them. I spent the rest of the day checking every lock on the house. I shut the curtains tight, made sure every door was bolted, and shoved a chair under the handle of the back door just in case. By the time the sun set, I was on edge, every noise making me jump. I sat in the living room with a flashlight by my side and a heavy wrench in my lap, listening. That night, the clicking sounded louder than before. It didn't stay outside this time, it moved, drifting along the side of the house, stopping and starting as if circling. I stayed in the living room, gripping the wrench, my eyes glued to the windows. The noise eventually faded, but I couldn't relax. I didn't go back to bed. The next morning, I checked the yard again. The tracks were back. This time, they didn't stop at the window. They went around the house in uneven loops, some overlapping, like whatever made them had wandered aimlessly. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but I couldn't figure out what I'd say. Instead, I doubled down on securing the house, nailing boards across the windows in the back and dragging furniture in front of the doors. It wasn't much, but it made me feel like I was doing something. That night, I stayed awake, sitting in the same spot in the living room with the flashlight and wrench. I didn't hear the clicking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the reach of the porch light. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The tracks were there again, deeper this time, as if something had pressed harder into the ground. They went all the way around the house, stopping briefly at each window before continuing on. I didn't leave the house after that. I kept the doors locked, the curtains drawn, and the lights on, even during the day. The clicking came back that night, faint and steady, tracing the perimeter of the house. I sat on the floor in the corner of the living room, clutching the wrench and barely breathing. The noise eventually stopped, but I didn't move until the sun came up. The following night, something changed. It started with a banging sound, loud and jarring, coming from upstairs. My heart pounded as I crept to the bottom of the staircase, staring up into the dark hallway. The banging came again, followed by a series of thuds, like heavy footsteps moving across the floor. I gripped the wrench tighter, paralyzed at the base of the stairs. Whatever was making the noise was in the house. I waited, my breath coming in short bursts as the footsteps moved toward the top of the stairs. I could hear the creak of the floorboards, the sound getting closer and closer. My legs felt like they'd given out beneath me, but I couldn't bring myself to move. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. I stayed there for what felt like hours, clutching the wrench and staring up the staircase. I didn't hear anything else that night, but I knew I wasn't alone. I still haven't gone back upstairs. I woke in the middle of the night, my head jerking up from the pillow as if something had tugged me awake. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness you only find in the deep hours when even the animals outside seem to hold their breath. My bedroom felt colder than usual, and the thin light of the moon crept in through the gap in the curtains, making long shapes on the walls. I wasn't sure what had woken me, but the discomfort in my chest told me to get up. That's when I noticed my son, Sam, standing in the doorway. He was only 9, but in that moment he looked smaller, almost frail, in his oversized pajamas. His face was pale, his eyes wide, and his hands clenched the hem of his shirt. I called out to him, though the sound of my voice didn't seem to reach him. It was as if he was locked in a bubble of silence, his mouth moving but no sound escaping. I swung my legs off the bed, the old floorboards creaking as I stepped toward him. My heart raced, though I tried to reason with myself that he was probably sleepwalking or dreaming. Kids do that, don't they? But as I moved closer, he finally whispered something low, barely audible, but enough to chill me through. "He's outside again." The words hit me harder than they should have, and I froze. I didn't know what he meant by again, but the way he said it made me feel like he'd been keeping secrets. I forced myself to walk past him, down the hallway and to the window at the front of the house. My feet felt like lead as I pulled the curtain aside, peering out into the yard. At first I thought it was just the shadows of the trees. The branches moved slightly in the night breeze and their outlines danced across the patchy grass. But then I noticed the figure. It stood unnaturally tall, almost unnervingly so, at the far edge of the yard near the tree line. My breath hitched. The figure didn't move. It didn't shift or sway or do anything I'd expect of someone standing there at this hour. It was just there, upright and watching. The faint light caught its eyes. No, not its eyes, like the glint you'd get off an animal's in the dark. My hand tightened on the curtain and I felt a surge of fear mixed with confusion. It couldn't be an animal. It was too upright, too human-like in its shape. But if it was a person, why weren't they moving? Why were they just standing there? And then it occurred to me that they could see me too. They had to know I was watching them. The figure's reflective gaze felt locked on the window where I stood in a pale nightgown, frozen and unsure of what to do. I forced myself to step back, letting the curtain drop. My heart thudded in my chest as I tried to think. Should I call the police, wake the neighbors? I turned to check on Sam, but he was gone. My stomach dropped as I hurried back to my bedroom, only to find him curled up on my bed, already asleep. It was as if none of it had happened. His small body rose and fell with slow breaths, and I stood there, staring at him, trying to convince myself that I hadn't seen what I just saw. The rest of the night passed uneventfully. I checked every lock twice before climbing into bed next to Sam, but sleep never came. My mind was stuck on the figure, and the hours seemed to drag until morning. When the sun finally rose, its light poured into the house and cast everything in a warm, reassuring glow. It felt silly almost, the way my fear from the night seemed to dissipate. I checked the yard again, peeking out the same window as before, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. Just the grass, slightly dewy, and the tree line beyond. I convinced myself it had to have been a trick of the moonlight, my tired brain making shapes out of shadows. That was until I went to the kitchen. The back door was wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. The lock was still intact and there was no sign of forced entry, but I knew I had locked it before bed. I remembered it clearly because I'd tugged on it twice, just like I always did. The sight of the door sent a jolt through me, and I found myself walking toward it, almost against my better judgment. The yard at the back of the house felt different. There were no birds chirping, no rustling of leaves, just an eerie kind of silence that made the hair on my arms stand up. The ground beneath the doorframe looked strange, like someone had walked through the damp dirt and grass, but the tracks weren't human. They were too long, too narrow, and spaced too far apart for anything I could explain. I slammed the door shut, locking it again and pulling the curtains over the window. When Sam came into the kitchen, a little while later, he was his usual self, bright-eyed, hungry, talking about his cartoons. He didn't remember anything about the night before, not standing in the hallway, not whispering those awful words, and definitely not the figure outside. But I remembered, I still do. Every night since, I've locked the doors and checked the windows, making sure everything is secure. And every morning, without fail, I find the back door open again, always wide open, always swinging slightly in the breeze. I haven't seen the figure again, but sometimes late at night I catch glimpses of movement in the yard. I don't go to the window anymore. I don't think I want to know what I might see.